Hey folks, welcome back. Thank you for joining us on this video, audio, book journey into Purpose Work Nation. So we're going to get into the meat of it today. As I mentioned, chapters 1 through 3 are more kind of philosophical, historical context that kind of set up why business is the front line of national renewal, how to effectuate our nation's purpose and the ethics of the bison, and really what's at stake. So chapter 3 is that kind of culture, cold Civil War stuff. This chapter 1, is titled "Business as Religion, Villain, and Savior." It's an attempt to look at business through multiple perspectives because it's not entirely a religion, although for many folks in the United States they regard it as such. It's not entirely good for humanity or good for the United States, the people who live here, and the environment. And it's not entirely bad. It's created a lot of awesome stuff. So before we jump in, I want to actually begin to start modeling what it is that we're inviting leaders and organizations and really anybody who calls this place home to do. And that's to bring their whole selves into work, relationships, society. So I'm going to begin that with what's called a PIES check-in. I'm not sure where I first heard it. It could have been the Mankind Project, could have been somewhere else. But it stands for physical, intellectual, emotional, spiritual. So I'm just going to check in real quick on those. And I'll do that for the remainder of these videos because I don't want this to be just a headpiece for y'all. I want to invite you all to do this with me. So let's see. Physically, I'm feeling good. I've gotten back into hot yoga. I've done about 30 classes in the last 40 days. Feeling strong. I was hoping to see my weight go from 245 back down to 230. No such thing happened. Now, either I put on a bunch of muscle in my legs and core, or I'm just carrying pandemic stress. Could be because I live like 2 blocks from a freeway that my body's just packing on, the cortisol. I don't know. So my ego took a little bit of hit, but we'll be moving soon, so we'll get to run another experiment when we're further away from a freeway. Also, dealing with arthritis in my pinky. I got it when I got COVID in May, and it still hasn't gone away, and it concerns me. I'm going to see a doctor about that. Intellectually, checking in pretty disgusted right now. I'm making my way through this book, The Documentary History of the United States, and just read Andrew Carnegie's essay on wealth. And I basically just wanted to punch the book because it obviously argues that we need extraordinarily wealthy people and extraordinarily poor people, and it's basically like kind of the beginning of the wealth gospel in a sense, like make a bunch of money and then give it away. And also, don't hold me accountable to how I'm making that money. So it very much ties in with what we're going to talk about today. Emotionally, yeah, there's sadness around what I just read. There's gratitude. Marriage is strong. My wife and I, we revisited our marriage purpose about a month or two ago and did a check-in recently on that. So I feel my marriage is stronger than it's ever been. So great gratitude there. Also gratitude. I signed a 5-figure keynote yesterday, which helps keep all this stuff alive. Spiritually, my morning practice. So I've got a little altar over here that I've been doing this since I began purpose work a decade ago, just kind of connecting with my purpose, other sacred objects, family, ancestors, praying for people who need it. And it's always kind of felt a little obligatory. Like I should do this as a purpose guide, but over the last, I would say, 3-4 months, I look forward to it. It's becoming like almost my favorite part of the day. Yeah, there's a lot of body stuff that happens. Tingles, expansiveness, all that good stuff. So I'm in, and I invite you to check in. If you want, go ahead and just pause this and check in with yourself. Better yet, invite someone close to you to do this check-in. So it's PIES: physical, intellectual, emotional, spiritual. Lastly, or not lastly, but at the end of every chapter, so we're beginning with chapter 1. At the end, I'm gonna reprise the 4 key takeaways of that chapter, and then the 4 discussion questions for a book club. So that is my invitation to you as you do this. Find someone else who is curious about this work, who loves the United States, who wants to see capitalism done right, and read this book with them. And then have this conversation. Just set up a half hour, and go through those 4 reflection questions together. And of course, if you want to engage more deeply, there's more good stuff at in the descriptions here. You can take a program to activate more purpose and meaning at work, book me for a workshop, keynote, all that good stuff. Yeah. So also want to note that this is the longest chapter, so this will be the longest video. And I've got plenty of coffee and water here, but what I've found, at least when I did the 2018 audiobook, my mouth stopped working. So you might witness a verbal decline as we move through this. Chapter 1: Business as Religion, Villain, and Savior. It's the only way to treat a white man. Laughter. I was 16 when I heard these words. I'm ashamed to admit it now, but I joined in the laughter and nodded in agreement. We had just finished a round of golf at my all-male and almost all-white country club, except for a few Japanese businessmen with whom we never interacted. We were sitting around a card table, smoking cigars and watching sports. Tony, the Cuban bartender, had just brought us our drinks. A friend of my father then said those lamentable words, and we all laughed. I didn't think anything of it, and we continued our conversation. In the 20th century, clubs like this one were where business got done. The relationships that form these aristocratic enclaves, from the yacht and golf clubs around our cities to the town clubs such as the Harvard Club in New York, the University Club in Chicago, and the Olympic Club in San Francisco, have been the engine oil of business. This was not to say you couldn't do business without belonging to such a club. It was just a lot easier as a member, as trust was assumed among members within each club and between members of these clubs via reciprocal guest agreements. So you could go to all these elite clubs if your club called ahead for you. And my dad made his living managing the wealth of many of our club's members. I was counseled to do the same: hang out with rich white people, ingratiate yourself, and do business with them. Business as religion. There is no sense of anything lost or wrong in joining or wanting to join these exclusive and primarily white male communities. As the thinking went, what was good for business was good for the nation. And business just happened to be done by white men. So successful white businessmen became our revered clergy. Men like Michael Milken, Jack Welch, Warren Buffett, and Ted Turner adorned magazine covers. They bought jets and estates and offered us a gospel of prosperity. During my childhood, our economy was credited with defeating the Third Reich and the USSR and putting a washing machine in every home and a car in every driveway. There was an implied nobility in it, and it never bothered us that women or BIPOC folks weren't among our revered clergy or benefited from it. Our post-World War II prosperity and Milton Friedman's "the business of business is business" battle cry empowered us to pursue profit as a moral good. It meant we had moral license to do whatever was necessary to expand profits, thus sanctioning our discriminatory, anti-labor, and environmentally disastrous business practices. As far as I knew, capitalism was the best of all possible worlds. Of course, I wanted to fit in, did not know any better, and so I followed the path laid out before me. I picked one of the whitest majors, finance, joined a white fraternity, poured drinks at a white bar, dated white sorority women, played sports, made the dean's list, and held leadership positions. Like most of my fraternity brothers, I wanted to be successful and used college as a resume polisher for my default white male destiny. A career in white professional services, a house in the white suburbs, complete with a white housewife, 2.3 white kids, membership at a white country club, and a white church. Warning. The following section contains some hard truths. It's bitter but vital medicine. Every leader must understand the broad strokes of how we got here in order to effectively lead in an increasingly diverse and volatile economy. The last 40 years of historical research has revealed a vastly different story of the nation and capitalism than the version that you and I were likely taught. We're going to cover a portion of it here to prepare a solid foundation of our nation's history and economy. So if you discover facts new to you, please explore the source material in the endnotes, as well as consider reading David Graeber and David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything, Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States, Nicole Hannah-Jones's The 1619 Project, A New Origin Story, and Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous People's History of the United States. As mentioned in the author's notes, please be kind to yourself, take breaks, and seek support if necessary. So I want to expand on that for just a second. I didn't read any of these books in college or grad school. They weren't part of my American civics education. Granted, I studied finance, so perhaps I would have encountered people's history of the United States had I chosen history or politics or sociology. But most folks in business have never read these books. They don't know actually what this nation is. You know, it's baseball games and fireworks and capitalism uber alles is the narrative, but that's actually, there's a lot more going on. And these books point to really what 80% of Americans have actually experienced here. So the black American experience, the indigenous American experience, the poor white experience. A couple other things I'll put on your radar. So first, Dawn of Everything, even though it's not technically about the United States, it talks about the complex, sophisticated civilizations that were here when the first settler colonialists and explorers got here. So we have a narrative that everything was backwards and, you know, not sophisticated. Absolutely not true. A lot of the things we'll explore here will reveal that. So if you really want to start with American history, you got to start with what was actually here before the Europeans got here. The other book I'll put on your radar is, I think it's called White Trash, 400 Years of, I don't know, class or something in America. And although it's spoken of in Howard Zinn's book, People's History, the coastal and urban aristocracy has done everything it can to keep most poor white folks poor. And that book lays it out. So I would definitely encourage that book, as well as the series on HBO, Exterminate All the Brutes. That is more of a global history of racialized exploitation, domination, dehumanization. And the United States just happened to be this case study for it, because we found this new land full of non-white people, and we just followed the playbook. So all this is to say, please dig into these source texts, because it will substantiate a lot of what we're going to cover here today. Business as villain. Success in business in the 1980s meant wealth, luxury, and subsistence wage servants to bring us drinks, mow our lawns, clean our houses, wash and valet our cars, carry our bags, raise our kids, make our food. And the weird thing was that no one talked about it. No one seemed to notice that if you squinted your eyes, the Chicago suburbs looked a lot like southern plantations, with mostly white homeowners and mostly BIPOC service providers. Not that I was privy to overt malice or secret meetings, but the centuries-old relationship between white folks and the BIPOC help continued. While it was working out pretty well for us, it obviously wasn't working out for black folks. Black men earned 56 cents and black women earned 63 cents for every $1 a white man earns. And black families, as we've mentioned, have 1 cent of wealth for every dollar a white family has. Although I was not aware that anyone actively sought to oppress and exploit people of color or women, the net effect of our jobs, biases, marriages, and suburban lifestyles did exactly that. So I'll share a little quote from Louis C.K. from 2008. I'm not saying that white people are better. I'm saying that being white is clearly better. Who could even argue? If it was an option, I would re-up every year. Oh yeah, I'll take white again. Absolutely. I've been enjoying that. I'll stick with white. Thank you. End quote. Our collective actions, giving contracts and jobs to mostly other white guys, NIMBYism, so not in my backyard, and cutting taxes, education, and social services that disproportionately benefit women, children, the elderly, and BIPOC folks, ensured that we kept the power and wealth for ourselves, while women and people of color made a lot less money serving us. Younger folks are now making us feel more comfortable about that, but nothing has really changed. Granted, we do have increasing diversity in boardrooms, media, and political leadership, and overtly racist attitudes have declined substantially. Unfortunately, our country remains structurally segregated, geographically, politically, racially, and generationally. So how did it become this way? Divide, dehumanize, dominate, and dispossess has been our way since go. Since the first ships of settler colonialists arrived on Turtle Island, what First Peoples actually called this place, our legacy has been one of exploitation for profit. This is not to diminish what is good, true, and beautiful about our religions, culture, technologies, and art, but rather to shed light upon our nation's shadow and incorporate a central theme of our legacy and political economy that is frequently ignored or resisted. We need to see the whole map if we are to understand who we are, how we got here, and in what manner we should proceed. This is also not to romanticize African or First Nations people who also had political maneuvering, fierce warriors, injustice, slavery, and torture. However, what the First Nations had, but our settler colonialist ancestors did not, besides a rightful claim to Turtle Island, were intact cultures in which war, peace, spirituality, politics, economics, culture, love, and friendship existed in relative harmony, both within each nation and between them, and with the earth and the Great Spirit. What they had was a general regard for personal sovereignty, especially that of women and children, and the prolific ability to invent dozens of social, political, and economic arrangements to maximize freedom, sovereignty, and flourishing. What First Nations had was an understanding of property that included the responsibility to care for it, versus the European notion of property rights, whose origins are rooted in the laws of the Roman Empire, granting the right to use, enjoy, abuse, and destroy one's land, animals, and people at will, and to use violence towards any threat to one's property. This master-slave ethos is still guiding our language, culture, organizations, legal system, employee contracts, and moral reasoning. For example, consider these Latin words: familis, referring to the slaves and servants of a household from which we get family, and familiar, Dominus, from which we get domicile and dominate. Capitalis, meaning head, chief, first. And labor, meaning hardship, pain, toil, and fatigue. I'll just add one more in there I recently read. The word territory comes from the word to terrorize. All of these refer to our need to distinguish the dominator from the dominated: land, people, animals, and property. Conversely, First Nations people enjoyed a more mutualistic coherence between their people, cosmologies, politics, culture, economies, and Mother Earth. This symbiosis results in an enormous sense of belonging, meaning, security, and ease. In an only recently unearthed 1942 paper from Abraham Maslow, we now have a view rooted in Western psychology for understanding what the cultures and personalities of the original caretakers of this land might have been like. Maslow spent the summer of 1938 with the Blackfoot people in Alberta, Canada, one of the few relatively intact native communities at the time. These people had yet to be decimated by poverty, alcohol, and the assimilation policies of the Canadian government and Christianity. Maslow found a society marked by incredible freedom, self-esteem, and security. He surmised that 70 to 80% of Blackfoot people were more secure than the top 5% of the most secure Westerners. He discovered that, quote, they had feelings of being liked and loved, perception of the world as a warm and friendly place, a tendency to expect good things to happen, feelings of calm, ease, and relaxation, self-acceptance, a desire for adequacy with respect to problems rather than for power over people, social interest in the Adlerian sense, cooperativeness, kindliness, interest in others, and sympathy. Children are not humiliated by their parents as they are in our society. Inferior men are not humiliated by superior men, nor are the poor humiliated by the rich. The typical personality of the northern Blackfoot Indian is one characterized by dignity, friendliness, and containing little insecurity. Suspicion, envy, jealousy, antagonism, hostility, or anxiety. End quote. Quick side note, I sent this paper to David Wengrow, one of the co-authors of Dawn of Everything, and he hadn't yet discovered it. And he was meaningfully moved by it. He's like, yes, finally, it's not just hearsay, or we have to interpret what the Jesuits and Franciscans told us about these people, but now we actually have like a Westerner, someone who's studied psychology, to say this is actually what people were like. It is perhaps not surprising that when invading settler colonialists were captured by natives and given the opportunity to leave, they chose to stay among the natives. Even captured children, when confronted by their biological parents, chose to stay with their indigenous captors. As Benjamin Franklin observed, quote, when white persons of either sex have been taken prisoner by the Indians and lived a while among them, though ransomed by their friends and treated with all imaginable tenderness to prevail with them to stay among the English, yet in a short time they become disgusted with our manner of life and the care and pains that are necessary to support it, and take the first opportunity to go escaping again into the woods from whence there is no reclaiming them. End quote. Further, many of the 18th century ideas and practices we attribute to European intellectuals, and upon which our nation's founding documents rest, such as liberty, equality, deliberative democracy, and societal critique, were observed by Europeans in their 16th century discussions with indigenous leaders. So, in the 1500s, they were observing these things among these people that they regarded as backwards. Of course, we'll find out what happened after that. Additionally, we owe to First Nations people many fields of inquiry and practices that we've only recently begun to explore, such as depth psychology, restorative justice, regenerative land management, public housing, and the sovereignty of women and children. Of course, we did not deliver upon these ideas as the First Nations did. In practice, we took what we could comprehend through our master-slave, power over others worldview and just left the rest. This ethos continued as we set upon the continent of Africa to steal, traffic, enslave, murder, rape, and torture their people, resulting in a total of 4 million enslaved people by 1860. And given that the average lifespan of an enslaved person at the time was 10 to 36 years, depending on their conditions and the duration of the practice, it is likely that the number of people we dehumanized, dominated, and dispossessed is many times that number. To prevent worker and enslaved uprisings, we needed to prevent solidarity between poor Europeans, First Nations people, and those we enslaved. And so we invented the concept of whiteness to give poor Europeans a class distinction and moral license and economic roles, such as strikebreakers, slave patrols, and forward rangers, to keep the native frontier moving west and ensure relative peace in the east, and to keep our forced labor camps running smoothly. These forces, composed largely of Scots-Irish, eventually morphed into the police and military forces we know today. The impact, while different in tactics, is eerily familiar. Dehumanize, divide, dominate, and dispossess those who have something we want. We also gave incentives to wealthier white men to enslave Africans by awarding an extra 75 acres of land for every person they enslaved, which created an incredible market and resulted in a hugely profitable influx of the enslaved who both worked the land and built our nation's public infrastructure. Now, what some of you might not know is that most of this actually happened in the Northeast, like Providence, Rhode Island, New York City, Boston, were huge ports that a lot of these folks first came through. And then, of course, the southern ports of, well, New Orleans and I don't know, maybe Charleston, I'm not sure which. But so the northeast legacy of slavery is just as profound as the South, at least in the early days. Broadway in New York was cleared by those we enslaved. The canals were dredged, and roads, sewers, and bridges were built by the enslaved. The wall from which Wall Street is named, the White House, and the Capitol were all built by those we enslaved. Citi and J.P. Morgan financed the trade of the enslaved and accepted enslaved humans as collateral. Aetna and New York Life insured the trade. With our domestic exploitation project nearing completion in the 19th century, we turned our gaze towards Latin America and the South Pacific, and then in the 20th century to the rest of the world. A reading of the last 100 years of U.S. foreign policy reveals that we have done little but preach about democracy and human rights, while undermining and impoverishing other countries with expensive debt, overthrowing their legitimate governments, assassinating their leaders, drone striking insurgents and innocent bystanders, installing corrupt puppets friendly to U.S. business interests, and then bullying them to sell us their labor and natural resources for pennies on the dollar. As of 2022, U.S. foreign policy has interfered in the elections and power structures in 80 countries. That's most of them. I think it was like 140 or something. Remember to take care of yourself. It is, of course, a great shame that we ginned up countless narratives that First Nations and foreign people were backwards in order to justify war, theft, genocide, slavery, oppression, and interventionism. And like the Roman Empire, we did not save our worst behavior for foreign people. We also maintained our ethos of divide and conquer at home. We used our sharp elbows to pay subsistence wages, beat the competition, find the angle, maximize return, plunder nature, get the girl, lock up bad guys, make it rain, and isolate children, the elderly, and the infirm. As anyone who has ever been to high school knows, it's not just white people oppressing non-white people. It's everybody oppressing everybody else. It is our history, identity, and practice. Whether we look at ourselves as a country of one master race, two genders, three lifestyles, urban, suburban, rural, or four distinct political attitudes, real America, like Sarah Palin, free America, like Milton Friedman, smart America, like Sheryl Sandberg, and just America, like Angela Davis. Or five distinct generations, Zennials, Millennials, Gen X, Baby Boomers, Silent Generation, or 12 distinct socioeconomic communities, as Dante Cini and James Gimple offer in Our Patchwork Nation. Or our hundreds of ethnicities. We are a divided nation. The result is that 74% of us don't have any friends from different ethnicities. 69% of us don't have any friends from different generations. 63% of us don't have any friends with different levels of education. 62% of us don't have any friends who vote differently. And 56% don't have friends from different income brackets. And it appears that white folks are the most segregated group, as 92% of white people have networks that are only populated by other white people. So 92% of white folks only have white friends. And it's getting worse, not better, as our education system is increasingly segregated along the lines of race, class, and politics. Over half of our children now attend deeply segregated schools. They're also called apartheid schools, where it's like you only get one person of another race. Unfortunately, when we divide and blame each other, we miss the deeper, dehumanizing narrative of our story, not to mention the shared shame, suffering, and hopelessness we all feel because of it. We also miss the power of owning our history and the solidarity we could harness to live our nation's purpose and dream a better future together. Of course, there is good reason to keep dividing and blaming each other. The implications of this history are unpleasant to say the least. So that we can own our history and create a new future, let us now turn to a controversial phrase that describes our past and present: white supremacy. Many of our divides overlap and enforce a dynamic of Christian white male ableist heteronormative supremacy, or for short, white supremacy. Today, being part of a white supremacist system doesn't just mean lynching and burning crosses, although there are 10 million citizens with white nationalist and insurrectionist sympathies, and a few thousand white nationalists still actively perpetuating domestic terrorism upon our fellow citizens of Jewish, African, Hispanic, Indigenous, Muslim, and Asian descent. It means that we all participate, regardless of how we vote, work, worship, or love, in an interlocking system that keeps wealthy white families on top and deprives others of their rights, dignity, and the fruits of their labor. As Robin DiAngelo, she wrote White Fragility, offers, white supremacy is comprised of dozens, if not hundreds, of explicit and implicit beliefs about whiteness and non-whiteness that have been codified into our institutions, laws, and norms that govern every sector of our society, including and especially our economy. Quote, white supremacy captures the all-encompassing centrality and assumed superiority of people defined and perceived as white, and the practices based on that assumption. White supremacy is not simply the idea that whites are superior to people of color, although it certainly is that, but a deeper premise that supports this idea: the definition of whites as the norm or standard for human, and people of color as an inherent deviation from that norm. We use this term to refer to a socio-political economic system of domination based on racial categories that benefit those defined and perceived as white, like me. This system rests on the historical and current accumulation of structural power that privileges, centralizes, and elevates white people as a group. End quote. While it is no longer a conspiracy by Romans, monarchs, barons, or slavers, it continues because of our fear, ignorance, and lack of moral imagination. It's the water we swim in. It's why luxury cars and strip clubs exist. It's why Jack Welch boasted about culling the bottom 10% of GE, and why women live in constant fear of sexual assault. It's why the hidden becomes visible when enough angry white folks get together. For example, when students at a Connecticut prep school, this is my wife's prep school, wrote "kill all N-word" in their yearbooks in 1995. Why Yaleys marched on campus in 2010 chanting "no means yes" and "yes means anal." And why the Unite the Right rally in Charleston in 2017 chanted "Jews will not replace us." Its form and expression keep changing, but its impact remains. It has evolved from a war against women, children, the elderly, First Nations, and African peoples, and into laws and practices such as the Three-Fifths Compromise, broken treaties, black codes, broken treaties with Native people, deporting over 1 million U.S. citizens of Mexican descent in the 1920s and 1930s. I think it was 1880s, the Chinese Exclusion Act. We said, like, all right, we're done with Chinese, no more. Everyone get out. Contract lending, Chinese and Japanese internment camps, Jim Crow laws, sundown towns, payday loans, redlining, police brutality, and the preschool to prison pipeline. So if you're unfamiliar with any of those terms, just Google them. They're all have Wikipedia pages. So I want to share a quote from Malcolm X that I think captures this quite well. Quote, "Racism is like a Cadillac. They bring out a new model every year." End quote. What else can explain why black families have only 1 cent of wealth for every dollar a white family has? We'd have to say there's either something deficient in black people or their culture, which is both explicitly racist and factually incorrect, as it can be argued that much of our nation's finest writing, music, legislation, science, technology, athletics, art, spirituality, and cuisine came from the minds, bodies, and souls of black folks. Or we'd have to admit that our system creates better outcomes for white people as a function of the system, not a bug in the system. Function. If we admit the former, at least we can be factually correct. Now comes the hard part. We must acknowledge that regardless of our racial, ethnic, religious, or class status, we depend on this white supremacist and ecocidal system to survive, and that staying out of it, or apolitical, or doing nothing to change it is a vote in favor of it. Remaining neutral ensures that no matter how hard our fellow citizens from BIPOC communities try, they will not succeed. Eventually, they will be forced by the market to serve wealthy whites. Staying neutral is not just a vote for further oppression and biosphere collapse, but it is also an assault upon our national purpose and our wild-eyed, rambunctious nature. As anthropologist Margaret Mead observed, quote, "We have no tolerance at all of anybody putting up with anything. We believe that whatever is going wrong ought to be fixed." End quote. So my co-founder Heidi and I, we met each other through this community called the Listen First Coalition. It's 250 organizations that are working to depolarize the nation, mostly along political lines, but race is obviously a big part of it. Is blacks, people of color, gay folks lean left, and white folks, straight folks lean right. And so we're always in this conversation of how do we create a wide enough tent, a big enough tent that is going to have everybody who calls this place home see that there's a place for them. And what has emerged in things like the Forward Party and America. What is it called? Oh, Meeting of America. Is like, okay, let's just try some language that's going to bring in conservative folks, and I don't think that's a bad thing. But it ignores the purpose of our nation, which is fundamentally progressive, which we explored in the author's notes. So we have these foundational statements that are not about appeasing afraid, poor white folks. Our purpose is not appeasement. It's a vision that is different from reality. Now we have to do things, we have to be skillful and caring and act with a lot of grace with folks who aren't on board with that purpose. I'm not saying we repeat the past and then turn them into second-class citizens or anything like that. But what we're about is not what they think that this place is about. So that we're in a pickle. We're in a pickle because we have to deal with this. And we'll explore this later in chapter 3, because these are also our customers, also our investors, also our employees. We've got MAGA folks at the highest level in corporate America, obviously in DC too. So there's no clear answers here. We have a progressive vision. We've got a great opportunity with business as the strongest sector in society. And we have a bunch of folks who would rather us not fulfill our purpose. All right. I'll continue. While it's understandable to not want to face our past and present, it is dishonorable to make the inquiry itself wrong, ignore it, ban it, deflect it, engage in doublespeak, or cancel people. A true leader is willing to have the discussion, accept the facts, admit her wrongs, face his accuser, make satisfactory amends, and ensure further harm ceases, and call forth a future of collective flourishing. A true leader is willing to look at the data we've explored, in addition to the data concerning climate change, which is also deeply concerning. If anything, we need a functioning political economy because of that. We're all going to be gone in 30, 40 years. And until recently, few leaders have been willing to embrace this data and answer the call. Answering the call is a long and hard road. And due to the volatility and competition in our economy, little time to observe and reflect, along with the great fear of screwing it up or sounding unhinged, it is tempting to lower our sights on what's possible. It's easy just to snack on small surface level wins like science fair exhibits about climate change and diverse TV shows, board members, entertainers, Olympians, politicians, and scholarship winners. It's easy to comfort ourselves by saying, it's not as bad as it used to be, and deflect our responsibility. And it's uncomfortable to face the fact that while our rhetoric has become more humane and inclusive, the operating system has not been updated. We're still burning our house down. We're still oppressing. Structural racism is alive and well, and making life considerably less free for BIPOC folks today than it was 50 years ago. So things have actually gotten worse than civil rights for BIPOC folks. If we continue to ignore and thus damage our powerful purpose, we do so not just at the expense of flourishing of our BIPOC sisters and brothers in our biosphere, but also at the expense of white flourishing as well. White people are also hustling for subsistence wages and struggling with obesity, addiction, and lack of affordable education and healthcare. White families also don't have clean air, water, and food. Let's pause here for a second. I'm privileged. I got a Ivy MBA, upper middle class upbringing, and I'm a white guy. I don't yet own a house. I live 2 blocks away from a freeway. I'm breathing all that diesel exhaust. It's covering our fruits and vegetables. I also don't have clean water. We have to have a water filter here. And I'm in a food desert. I have to go at least a mile to find anything organic, anything that's actual food and not poison food. And I'm on the upper end of the socioeconomic spectrum, right? How is it for folks in Appalachia, rural Texas, Arizona? White folks are also getting punished by this thing. White children are also struggling with fear, anxiety, depression, and suicide. White people are also having trouble sleeping, myself, my wife included. White parents are also burnt out and stretched thin. White people are also being raped. Had we been guided by our shared purpose to face and heal our history and expanded the social and economic policies of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and followed the climate science of the last 40 years, then we all would have been better off. For example, just by addressing racism head-on alone, we would have generated an additional $16 trillion in our economy over the last 2 decades. In 2022, living our nation's purpose means making a living wage, which is $25 to $50 an hour with less than a 30-minute commute. It means affordable health care, less than 5% of our income. It means being part of a safe, loving, stable, and inclusive community. It means access to clean water, air, and soil. It means healthy and affordable food. It means small class sizes. It means sustainable and affordable public transit and housing, less than a quarter of our income. It means being free from oppression and having the right to vote. It means we do not get roofied and raped, nor murdered by police during a routine traffic stop. As we've explored already, this is not our lived experience. Well, at least we have each other to lean on in our despair. Nope. Even more than being divided into groups, within these groups, we frequently suffer alone. Only 47% of us belong to a spiritual community, which is down from 70% in 1999. 61% of us are lonely, which is up from 46% just a few years ago. 33% of us only have 1 to 3 close friends, and 17% of us have no close friends at all. And that's a double that number has doubled since 2013. 41% of us don't have a best friend, and that's up from 23% in 1995. And trust in our fellow citizens has fallen to 32% from 57% in 1968. Further, this dynamic seems to be impacting men disproportionately in what has been called a male friendship recession. The number of men reporting 0 friends has increased 5 times since 1995. Now that's really dangerous, because y'all know men. And if we're not connected, if we're not up to something, if we don't feel cared for, and we have access to firearms and ammonium nitrate, which is freaking everywhere, we have a powder keg, right? So we've divided, dehumanized, dispossessed, and just dominated everybody. Between groups, within groups, from each other, from family members. So given that we laugh 5 times less when we're alone than when we're with others, the more alone we are, the more our pursuit of happiness is unrealized. As you might imagine, this dynamic creates all sorts of mental health issues. 8.5% of us are clinically depressed, with 32.8% of us reporting an increase of depressive symptoms in 2021. In 2013, 1 in 6 of us took antidepressants. 3 times as many who did in 1996. So antidepressant use tripled from the 25 years from 1996. No, sorry, that's wrong. In the 7 years from 1996. No, wait. Come on, math. In the 17 years between 1996 and 2013. Thanks for your patience. This dynamic is especially crushing for our youth who have come of age in this era. Although they have an abundance of consumer choices, they grew up watching their parents check out and their leaders sell them out. They watched helplessly as leaders burned their planet, raised their tuitions, killed unions, offshored jobs, decimated our Main Street downtowns, and flattened wages. With little hope that anyone is looking out for them, they freaked out. In the 1990s, the average college student was 85% more anxious than those in the 1950s. And normal school children in the 1980s had higher levels of anxiety than psychiatric patients in the 1950s. This generalized fear also bleeds into how young people feel about each other. For example, in 1976, the year I was born, 46% of high school students believed most people could be trusted. In 2014, that number fell to 16%. And who can blame them? By 2018, suicide had become the leading cause of death for people 10 to 24 years of age, and it's getting worse. For example, between 2019 and 2021, suicide attempts among girls aged 12 to 17 increased 51%. These epidemics have led the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and the Children's Hospital Association to declare a national emergency in children's mental health. Initially, this meaninglessness, disconnection, fear, and isolation was good for business, as the core human needs for purpose and belonging that were traditionally met by family, friends, community service, religion, and relationships formed over years of steady work could now be readily, although not substantially or sustainably, sold back to us via an ever-increasing menu of goods and services. I'll pause here for a second. If you haven't seen Roger Dodger, I think it came out in like 2004, 3, with Campbell Scott, see it. It is a dark comedy that makes it very explicit that the work of advertisers is to point out how bad people's lives are and then to give them a consumer offering to fill that unfillable hole. Businesses could now make a healthy profit selling us new goods and services to deal with our woes, such as gated communities, social media, streaming services, cheap credit, automatic weapons, security systems, rape kits, air purifiers, private schools, fast fashion, prison contracts, bail bonds, active shooter trainings, payday loans, self-defense classes, pills, and dialysis centers. However, because of the last 4 decades of flat wages and buying power, we are increasingly unable to afford them. This moment is ripe for populist uprisings. Political entrepreneurs easily exploit our isolation by peeling us off into their ideologies and conspiracy theories that claim to explain and blame away our problems. For many of us, grievance is our common cause. All that binds many of us today is some version of life sucks and someone is going to pay. As we'll explore in Chapter 3, this has resulted in a cold civil war that could turn hot at any minute. Unfortunately, help isn't coming from DC. The very people we have hired to enact our purpose and ensure we survive and thrive are on the take. Landmark research at Princeton University on the state of our democracy has revealed that we are a democracy in name only. We are technically an oligarchy ruled by wealthy and corporate interests who ensure that their power and wealth expand at the expense of the well-being of our nation's diverse citizenry, democracy, and a livable world. Why in a nation with a purpose as noble as ours is this happening? Lots of reasons. 50 trillion to be exact. By cutting taxes for the wealthy and businesses and decimating unions and programs for everyone else, $50 trillion transferred from the bottom 90% to the top 1% over the last 4 decades. This means that a college-educated worker earning $72,000 today loses between $48,000 and $63,000 worth of income per year. In addition to the $16 trillion that racism has cost us, Another 50 trillion has been taken from all of us in the bottom 90 and given to the 1%. Add these two together, and we have a $66 trillion loss. Put another way, we stand to gain what Heather McGhee, the author of The Sum of Us, might refer to as a $66 trillion solidarity dividend. And that's her word, solidarity dividend. If we choose to address and resolve our racial and class divisions, we will then be far better off. Consider that 2/3 of this, or 44 trillion, could be taken home, invested in our home down payments, family vacations, preventative health care, education, starting a business, or civic organizations. Consider that the other third that we could be paid in taxes, so 22 trillion, could be invested in a public health care option, affordable housing, renewable energy, public transit, small class sizes, or reducing our debt. However, the oligarchy refuses to rest and instead continues to tighten its grip. According to a nonpartisan consortium of pro-democracy organizations, 262 restrictive voting bills in 41 states have been introduced since the 2020 election. And as of December 2021, 17 states have enacted 32 new voter suppression laws. And I think the number is now much higher. I think it's like 27 states now. You can find that all, I think it's Brennan Center. They do a pretty good accounting of this stuff. As such, it is no wonder that our trust in government has fallen dramatically. Now only 24% of us trust the government, down from a high of 77% in 1964. And 69% of us believe the government only serves the interests of the wealthy. In other countries, when these dynamics exist, we call it what it is: an apartheid, an oligarchy, or a corporatocracy. We call it anything but an actual democracy. As a result, many of us have lost hope. Although we have spent years and decades trying to achieve some level of security, peace, and ease in our lives, our lives are no better for the effort, and in many cases they are far worse. The American dream no longer fits the data and our lived experience. As such, over half of us now believe it is unattainable. All right, take a deep breath. You made it through that piece. Sorbet. With these hard but unnecessary truths out of the way, I recommend that you cleanse your palate. Sorbet. Do what you need to shake it off. Perhaps take a walk around the block, have a good cry, or seek a hug from a loved one. Business as savior. It's a quote from Thomas Friedman, New York Times, January 4th, 2022. I think our last best hope is the leadership of the U.S. business community. End quote. There is hope, although you'd be right to think business would be the last place to turn. It is also in the perfect position to revitalize our purpose, rehumanize our society, save the republic, and regenerate the planet. In fact, organizations are the only place where we have sufficient diversity. Told you my mouth had stopped working. Where we have sufficient diversity across race, gender, politics, ethnicity, ability, sexuality, and age. And the substantial and sustained time commitment, 2,000 hours per person per year. That's how much we spend at work. That is required to build diverse relationships and also transform beliefs and behaviors. And compared to the time we spend in less diverse religious, civic, and neighborhood organizations of 10 to 200 hours per year. Changing behavior isn't a matter of merely learning new information, but rather a sustained commitment requiring self-inquiry, modeling, practice, and support, and the network redundancy that organizations amply provide. Mechanisms of change must come from multiple people in a network versus top-down or merely learned in a class, sent out in an email, and painted on a wall. They must be continually modeled, developed, and expanded over time. The good news is that once 25% of a population adopts a belief or behavior, it soon becomes a norm. So that's a new tipping point. A lot of folks think it's like 13.5% or 25% or 15%, but Damon Santola's work at University of Pennsylvania has revealed it's actually 25%. Once a quarter of people start doing something, everyone starts going, all right, I need to look at what that is and why that matters. In a sense, an organization is like a sovereign entity with its origin story, values, mission, and vision, its own economy, media, and culture, with its own education, healthcare, and environmental functions. Further, business knows no borders, has vastly greater resources than any other sector, is unencumbered by term limits or the need to constantly whip up its base with hate and hyperbole. Additionally, and again paradoxically, business is regarded as the most ethical and competent sector, with 78% of us trusting our employer. And there's even greater trust in small businesses with less than 500 employees, which is where 46.8% of us work, as 94% of us trust small businesses to do the right thing. And what's more, people expect business to lead the way. 68% of us believe business should fill the government's leadership and trust void. Many businesses are starting to understand that future innovation and success don't depend on further extraction and exploitation, but rather on trust, psychological safety, purpose, wellness, sustainability, and collaboration. They know that 89% of people want to live their purpose at work, and that there is only a 1% chance of being fulfilled in life if we're not fulfilled at work. Because remember, that's where we're spending all of our time. They know how much better they perform when 100% of their employees feel safe, like they belong, can grow, activate their purpose, and do their best work. They know they cannot operate if the planet can no longer support life. Especially as artificial intelligence makes the rote and analytical cheap and easy. If there is any hope for our nation, we must remember and reignite what makes us uniquely human: purpose, creativity, and our bonds to each other. To this end, businesses invest heavily in learning and development, spending $367 billion per year, and $8 billion per year in DEI, and $57 billion per year in employee wellness. And as we'll explore in Chapter 4, these channels need a drastic revisioning in order to truly serve the nerds. I'm getting loopy. In order to truly serve the needs of employees, organizations, and the nation. You are likely aware of a few organizations in your industry who are well on their way to rehumanizing their cultures, sustainably reimagining their businesses, and using their brand, voice, and buying power to create a more perfect union. Organizations such as Ford, BlackRock, LinkedIn, PwC, New Belgium Brewing, Salesforce, Thomson Reuters, Airbnb, and Eileen Fisher Clothing invest heavily in sustainability, employee purpose, and belonging initiatives. While these companies are by no means perfect, they have chosen to follow the wisdom of Peter Drucker. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Because they know their cultures cannot serve only 1/3 of the workforce, white men. It's needed and it's time. As we'll explore in the next chapter, your employees, customers, and investors now demand it. Imagine each person you work with being connected to their purpose and to each other, bringing living wages and a sense of belonging and fulfillment back home, impacting the health and resilience of their families, neighborhoods, and ecosystems. Imagine the 20 largest employers in your area doing the same. Imagine the culture and economy of a nation where sustainable and equitable flourishing is the new normal. Imagine 330 million souls activated, curious, creative, caring, and connected. Imagine the sense of fulfillment you will have in helping bring forth this future. These ripple effects are what can make our sacred purpose real. There is plenty of precedent for business doing the right thing. Business has come to the aid of our democracy many times before. It rose to the challenge in the 1940s to mobilize the economy to defeat Hitler, to defeat anti-LGBTQIA plus legislation in 2015 in Indiana and 2016 in North Carolina. And many stopped selling automatic weapons in 2018 after the Parkland massacre. Because business leaders understand how important a functioning democracy is to the health of their enterprise, following the January 6th attack on the Capitol, hundreds of CEOs called for a second impeachment, paused donations to politicians who supported the attack, and issued a statement denouncing the restrictive voting efforts underway in a majority of our states. I'll pause here for a second. It's a little bad news update. Of those 400 or 500 CEOs who are like, hey, we're not going to support any election deniers or, folks sympathetic to the storming of the Capitol. Guess how many are left? 8. Like 95+% of those corporations said, okay, I think the media cycle has shifted. We can start giving money to people who deny the election. So 400 of those organizations had a moral awakening and then cowered. Just some data. So there's that 2 steps forward, 1.98 steps back thing happening with business right now. And we can do it a lot better, as we'll see in the second half of this book. Businesses are being called upon once again. If businesses decide they want to activate e pluribus unum, equality for all, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, by sustainably reimagining their supply chains, paying living wages, and creating cultures of purpose and belonging, they can do that. Further, due to their outsized influence in government, some business leaders have the ear and pocketbook of our public servants. If businesses want to reinstate the FCC fairness doctrine, to eliminate misleading and partisan news, or amend Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to make social media companies responsible for the content their algorithms surface, or make sustainable supply chains the law of the land, or provide a public healthcare option, thereby unburdening businesses from the growing hassle and expense of doing it themselves, and thereby liberating entrepreneurs and creating greater workforce agility, or ensure teachers are well paid and have small class sizes, or guarantee the right to vote, or see that our nation builds a renewable energy infrastructure, they can do that. They can do any of it. And as the data suggests, it's time to do all of it. Unfortunately, the majority of the business community has been resistant to actively steward the common good. But why? In the next chapter, we'll explore the myth that has driven our economy and culture since the beginning, and summon a new myth to guide us into a future of shared and sustainable prosperity. That was a marathon. So before we close, I just want to read to you the summary, chapter 1. First point, in the 20th century, capitalism was regarded as an unqualified moral good. Second, the current political economy of the United States fails to fulfill our nation's purpose and instead creates inequality, division, exploitation, climate change, and human suffering. Third, business is more powerful and trustworthy than the government. And the fourth, while this is undoubtedly an all-hands-on-deck moment for leaders across sectors, without the leadership of business, at best our nation will remain a languishing apartheid state. And at worst, the republic will fall and our planet will become uninhabitable. So the reflection questions for your book club or your book buddy. Now that you've ingested all this, it's time to explore how you feel about it. First question. What feelings arise as you consider that despite our powerful purpose, the United States is a white supremacist, ecocidal apartheid state? How have you benefited from white supremacy? How have you been constrained or imperiled by white supremacy? How would you feel if you shifted your organization to empower everyone to fulfill their potential and flourish? Thank you all for being with me on this journey, as imperfect as it is. As mentioned before, Down in the description, you can find more ways to engage: workshops, keynotes, courses, explore the research, pick up a conversation starter, all that good stuff. Till next time.